Hello everyone, good morning and welcome to this Maritime Employment COVID-19 update. I'd like to say a quick hello and welcome you all to this morning's webinar. I'm not going to be using my camera during the session. I think it'll be a bit distracting. I would rather focus on the content, so I'm just going to say a quick hello and move on. We've got around 45 minutes together today. Everyone will be muted during the session. I would love to hear your questions today. Please ask the questions using the question tool on the right-hand side of your screen. And yeah, absolutely want to hear your questions. So my team are working remotely from their kitchens and their back bedrooms and home offices, and they will feed me your questions to answer later on in the session itself today. So we have 449 participants on the webinar today. So we've got participants from all corners of the world and all sectors of maritime and indeed all levels. I can see from the attendee list that we have CEOs of shipping companies, and I can also see from the attendee list that we have graduates and we have people in the middle of their careers, managers, and all sorts of different levels of people who are joining in to take part today. So welcome to all of you. With so many participants, it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be impossible for me to answer all of your questions, but I will do my best to answer the main themes of the questions that come up today. So let's have a look at the contents of our session today. So contents, let's have a look. So we're going to start off with a little bit of background on myself and Faststream for those of you who don't know us. We're going to outline, or I'm going to outline the crisis so far, what we see in maritime. How is this crisis impacting maritime already? You know, we are very much in unprecedented times for everyone in maritime. We're all in this together, no matter which part of maritime you come from. And we're going to have a look and see how the crisis is panning out so far for the sector. We're going to look at how we see different organisations responding to the crisis. As I said to you, I welcome your questions. Would love to help you with the questions. Send them through. I'll answer as many as I can. And then we're going to finish up with looking at the future impact of the crisis on the maritime sector as a whole, and how is it going to impact people in maritime going forward. So first of all, a little bit about myself, bit of an introduction, if you like, bit of background. So I started Faststream 22 years ago. I was a wet behind the ears 27-year-old and had all my own hair, as you can see from these photographs. I've lost most of it over the years working in the maritime sector. And according to these pictures, I probably only have 2 ties that I ever wear for presentations. They must be my lucky ties. Maybe I should have worn one today. So going from me at the start, 22 years later, Faststream employs over 100 people. We're very much a global organisation recruiting for the maritime sector, literally all over the world, with 2 big teams here in the UK and Singapore. I'm very proud to say that we are very much the global market leader in maritime recruitment. And I personally, to put that into perspective, have probably placed over 1,000 people in my career so far. I've placed everything from graduates starting their careers all the way through to chief executive and everything in between. As my team would say, when I'm not jet setting around the world, speaking at conferences and taking part in events, I'm still very much a hands-on recruiter. But today I only do senior executive search work for C-suite. So I'm still in essence doing the same job that our recruiters are doing, and that is I'm recruiting for senior executives in the maritime sector and it's C-suite, so it's a little bit different, I guess. Like many of you who are listening today, I know what it's like to run a business in maritime. I, like you, feel the responsibility of being an employer. You know, we employ over 100 people I guess you would describe what we do as a maritime services business, and I feel that responsibility of being an employer, especially during these tough times and during the coronavirus crisis. So I think it's a really important point to make that maritime is a very broad sector. So from one end of the spectrum, your shiny, glamorous super yachts, all the way through to the somewhat less shiny oil tankers, it's a very broad marketplace. You've got the high profile cruise sector, very much recently in the public eye, for the wrong reasons, unfortunately, during the coronavirus, all the way through to LNG tankers that some people who don't work in maritime have probably never heard of. They've probably never even thought that LNG moves by tankers around the world. You've got classification societies, you've got consultancies, you've got insurers, you've got shipbrokers, you've got shipbuilding, you've got companies making high-tech kit, you've got engine manufacturers, the list goes on and on. Across all of the different divisions and teams and specialist consultants that we have here at Faststream, we recruit for all of these specialist areas. And so our kind of view of maritime is pretty broad. The maritime sector globally is huge, and we are all very much impacted by the current crisis. So to put that into perspective, and before we finally move on, I thought it might be useful to share with you an idea of our reach in maritime. So in the last 12 months, we've placed 863 people into jobs in the maritime sector. And this is literally from chief cook to chief executive and everything in between. The market is massive, and our reach is pretty broad. We're talking to a lot of people, we're talking to a lot of candidates, we're talking to a lot of companies at all sorts of different levels in those companies. And I guess that puts us in a bit of a unique position that we have a very broad perspective of what is happening out there in the maritime sector. And I'm going to share what you are telling us in my presentation and webinar today. So I'm going to go through some of that with you. So I think what I'd like to do next is I'd like to have a look at the crisis and how it's playing out. What I'd like to look at first of all is some of the things that we do know so far about the crisis. How is it panning out so far? So it's definitely not, contrary to what you may well read on social media and LinkedIn and some of these places, it's definitely not business as usual. These are crazy times. You know, we literally are, as the word has been used a lot, we are in unprecedented times. And I know the same as probably you do, that when I was leading our 2020 business planning, it really didn't figure in our SWOT analysis that a pandemic might be one of the threats to our business. This pandemic has sideswiped us all. Like most of us today, maritime for the most part is working from our kitchen tables and our back bedrooms and our laptops, on our sofas. The maritime industry is very much working from home. I think it's fair to say that we know that social distancing and what that means in different countries around the world and how that has been in place around the world. We know that social distancing is going to be with us until a vaccine is found, and that could be for the foreseeable future. Some companies have already put in place pay reductions. We have done that here at Faststream. We've all taken 10% pay reductions, and some companies have put in place 20% reductions and possibly more as well, but it's been fairly high profile. There have already been some high profile layoffs, redundancies. There's probably more to come in some sectors. We've read about that in the maritime press, and we know that that's already happening. We know that global mobility is proving to be a big problem for the maritime sector. I'll talk some more about this later on, but we know that this is an important factor. And when you talk to people in the maritime sector, we know that it changes every day. We know that it changes every day. We know that it's a very dynamic situation. We know that the news comes on and our marketplace changes every day. So let's take a look at what we don't know. So we don't know how long this is going to go on for, and we don't know how bad it's going to get. We don't know really what's going to happen with a vaccine. Whilst there is a lot of optimism around finding a vaccine, we don't know if we'll definitely find one, and we don't know if we do find one, when we will get it. We don't know when borders will open up, and we don't know when global mobility will return and when travel will become normal and straightforward again. So there's a lot of forecasting by some very clever people, but we actually really don't know when a recovery will happen or what it will look like. When we do come out of this, we don't really know how it will change us. We don't know how it will change our businesses. We don't know how it will change our markets, and we don't know how it will change our people. And very apt for today's conversation, we don't know how it will change how we all work going forward. So there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of unknowns about how the crisis is playing out so far. And it's an interesting time and a challenging time for all of us, both as employers and as employees. So what I'd like to take a look at is talking to CEOs of maritime businesses around the world. What are the 4 most likely scenarios for how the crisis will play out? What are maritime leaders talking about? What 4 crisis scenarios are they planning for? And I'd like to just have a look at those with you. So the first one that's talked about a lot is a kind of V-shape. We all read about it in the papers. This kind of fast in, fast out. You know, it gets bad quite quickly, but actually it recovers quite quickly. This V-shape crisis. A lot of maritime leaders are talking about a U-shaped crisis. So when the recovery is slower to happen, but when we do recover, we recover quickly. Some maritime leaders are talking about and have concerns, and we read about this again in the papers, about having a W-shaped crisis. So this is really the coronavirus peaking again, coming back. We go back into lockdown and a sort of out of the frying pan and into the fire scenario. You know, we've got this W-shaped crisis where we're in and out of periods of lockdown. And then the 4th shape crisis, I've described it as F-shape. If I'm honest, I didn't really know what to call this one. When I talk to people in business and talk to, in particular, maritime leaders, and they described this kind of prolonged, widespread recession, this big, long-term, possible downturn and all the doom and gloom that goes with it. Well, I don't want to swear on a presentation, but the F word seemed to describe this crisis quite well. So that's where the F shape came about as an F-shaped crisis, because it's going to be pretty bad. So let's take a look at which scenario most maritime leaders think is going to happen. Like me, and probably like you, our view probably changes based on how much news we've watched that day, and where we are on the emotional roller coaster that we are all going through, which is living through the coronavirus. Remembering that the view of maritime leadership around the world directly impacts their view of people and the decisions that they make about people. So most leaders we talk to, and most leaders I talk to, seem to think that a U-shaped crisis in maritime is most likely. But it's clear from talking to people and clear from looking at the industry as a whole that the shape of the U will vary between sectors and quite possibly vary between geographies, between countries. So a really good example here, a really high profile example, is the cruise sector. So the cruise sector has been very hard hit, sorry. A V-shaped crisis is unlikely, and the shape of the U is likely to be quite wide. Obviously, coming into this, the cruise sector has been very much in the public eye for, unfortunately, all of the wrong reasons, and consequently, has been very hard hit. And so you can see that, they're going to have tough times in the cruise sector for the next year or two. And that the shape of the U is going to be kind of wide and flat, and it's going to be pretty hard for the cruise sector. And this really reflects in the decisions that the sector is making already. So cruise companies have started laying people off, making redundancies. Many of you will have read this week about Carnival, the world's biggest cruise operator, this week announcing, I think it was over 450 people to unfortunately be made redundant and potentially lose their jobs. So the cruise sector is a good example of how the U might look compared to and very differently to other sectors. So the offshore sector, again, been quite high profile and very hard hit. Elements of container shipping also very hard hit. We've read quite a lot of high profile stuff about the container shipping sector and liner and how hard that's been impacted by the crisis so far. But then some sectors of maritime, like for example ship management, their core business is, so far from what I hear and what I'm told, relatively unaffected. And in fact, they might even grow their business during this difficult time, which is really what the ship management business did coming out of, even during and coming out of the global financial crisis. I was talking to one ship management company recently, and they were telling me that they have never seen so many new inquiries from companies looking to put their ships into management. And that's a real reflection of perhaps, the view of the wider market, but of a sector of maritime that might well prosper during these very difficult times. I'm not an economist. I'm not a futurist, and I'm not going to analyse each sector of maritime, but I think it's important to recognise how wide the maritime sector is, and the shape of the U will vary from sector to sector. And there are a lot of sectors and subsectors in maritime, and they're not all going to be impacted in the same way, far from it. Even in the same sectors of maritime, some companies will be on, to use an Americanism, will be on offense, and some companies in those same sectors will be on defense. If an organization comes into this and they're very much in, if you like, peak fitness as an organization, there may well be opportunities to be had for those companies. Whether that is an opportunity to make acquisitions, or whether that's an opportunity for them to hire people that they wouldn't normally be able to hire, there will be an opportunity for these companies to prosper if they're coming into it kind of, as I say, on offense, and those businesses are at peak fitness. But I think the key takeaway here is that the impact on people of the coronavirus will be very much sector by sector, and even within those sectors, the impact will be company by company. I don't think it's going to be the same for all companies, and certainly not for all sectors. So we really can't control the crisis, but we can control our response to the crisis. And I think it's fair to say that for maritime leaders, there's not much black or white out there right now. We are all operating in a sea of grey, and we really got to kind of operate in this new environment. Companies are already adapting and responding to the crisis, making changes to their businesses. And what I would like to do is share a bit of a snapshot of how some companies are responding to the crisis and the sort of things that are being talked about at a senior level in those organisations. And so let's have a look at some of these scenarios, some of these companies and what they're doing. So the first sort of group of companies, I guess, is I would describe them as treading water. So a lot of companies are simply not doing anything at all. They're not doing anything different. They are literally treading water, waiting to see how the crisis develops and waiting to see what impact the crisis is really going to have on their businesses. As I touched upon earlier, one of the big things about the coronavirus so far is that the environment, the business environment changes every day, and it's a very fluid situation. And when you talk to people in business in maritime, and they've been doing a lot of planning and looking at different scenarios and figuring out what their response is going to be to this, they say, well, look, I develop a plan, I develop a strategy, then something changes, and it goes out the window, and I've got to develop a new one. And so I'm going to sit tight and wait and see how this plays out, what the impact's going to be, and I'll respond accordingly. Many companies are taking advantage of government support. So in the UK, we've got the furlough scheme. In Singapore, there's government assistance, and in various countries around the world, different governments are supporting employers and employees in different ways. And many companies are taking advantage of this support. And really what they're doing is they're kind of buying time whilst they wait and see what happens. It's fair to say we've never been in this landscape before. We don't know what it looks like. This is new. It's kind of uncharted territory. And really leaders in maritime in these companies, they're very reluctant to make hasty decisions, either to hire people, clearly, and they're very reluctant to make hasty decisions to fire people. And so a lot of companies who are treading water, they're simply not doing either. They're sat tight. They're sat tight waiting to see what's going to happen. When they see what happens, then they'll put in place some plans to really kind of move forward again. So the other big topics that is very pertinent in the maritime sector today is really mobility or lack of mobility. So this is one of the maritime sector's biggest challenges, and it's driving a lot of recruitment activity across all sectors. And I know this because it's keeping us very busy, and we're quite a big part of this. So with borders still closed, and for the most part around the world, a lot of borders between countries are still closed. Yes, there's been a relaxation in some locations, but not very much. Travel is still very difficult. To get people on commercial flights, to move people around the world, it's still very, very difficult to do that. And there are some big complexities around things like crew changes. There are some big complexities around projects needing boots on the ground, whether that's ships in dry dock or ships in yards or inspections or ship visits or just projects that need people. There are some big challenges around that around the world. So we still very much have critical people unable to travel and still in lockdown. People who normally would be out flying about all over the world, visiting projects, visiting ships, doing stuff, they're unable to do so. They are in their kitchens and back bedrooms working from home, and they can't get on airplanes and travel very easily. So there's some real clever thinking taking place. Companies are increasingly looking to us for in-country solutions. So we're getting a lot of inquiries from companies who are asking us to help them with people challenges on the ground and in country. A really good example of this came up only last week, where we were asked to recruit a crew for a vessel delivery from Singapore to West Africa. So one of our clients had a vessel coming out of a yard in Singapore. They needed to get it to West Africa, but because of travel restrictions and lack of mobility, the crew needed to be already in Singapore and ready to go. And when they got to West Africa, there were some challenges that we had to overcome around the repatriation of that crew from West Africa. But that's a good real-time example. Okay, so it's focused on a crewing piece, which is just part of our business, but it's a good example of how mobility is driving some of the people challenges in the maritime sector. And it's likely that this is going to be an ongoing people challenge that will require some fairly innovative solutions to overcome going forward. So one of the things that we're seeing here is we are all very much in uncharted waters together. Maritime companies are no different. None of us saw the pandemic coming. As I said earlier, it very much has sideswiped us. It wasn't part of our 2020 SWOT analysis. And consequently, companies are looking for people who can come in with certain skill sets and help them out to get through this crisis and get out the other side. So we're seeing very much an increased level of interest in executives and specialists on an interim and a contract basis to come into companies to work for set periods of time to help companies overcome some of the challenges they face to get through the crisis. So some of the areas that we've seen an increase in demand for is people with crisis management crisis management experience. We've seen an increase in demand for people who have experience in reorganisations and restructures, and we've seen an increase in demand for people with strategy skill sets and strategy planning skill sets. And so I guess these companies, they want more flexibility. They have a problem. They want to bring in expertise from outside to help them through this, but they don't necessarily want to commit to these people on a long-term basis. They want to buy in this expertise and get it in to do a project and then say thank you very much. So we're seeing quite an uptick in demand for interim executives and people on contract. The next group of people, or group of companies rather, I would describe as kind of in this group of kind of keep calm and carry on. I'm not sure that many companies would describe themselves as unaffected in the current crisis, but you know, there are companies who are going to do better than others. I don't like, and it doesn't feel quite right to describe companies in this current crisis as being sort of winners and losers, but there for sure will be companies who do better than others during the crisis for a variety of reasons. And like I said earlier, some companies will come into this on offense and see this period as an opportunity rather than being on defense during this difficult time. So these companies that are coming into this are very much pressing on with recruitment regardless. As we saw in 2008 during the global financial crisis, market turmoil will definitely shake out what you might call sort of unicorn candidates, if you like. So these are the people who are normally near impossible to recruit. They're very, very difficult to find people, and they're people who companies in a normal marketplace would find very difficult to get hold of. You know, they say that there's only two reasons why people change jobs. Something changed or something didn't change, and right now there's a lot of change out there in all sectors, but indeed in the maritime sector. And this change, this market turmoil, will shake out unicorn candidates that companies will pick up. And so companies with a positive outlook and a longer term sort of positive view of the world are using this as an opportunity to try and hire these people. I can say that with confidence because we're receiving the briefs from these companies who are asking us to do this. And recruitment of strategic hires has very much continued. The process might have changed a little bit, but companies who have very important strategic hires, they're very much pressing on with that recruitment, assuming that those companies have a reasonably positive view of their world and of their marketplace and of their own organisations. They're pressing on with that, just with with a different process. So most of us by now are pretty well adjusted to the rhythm and routine of working from home. The maritime sector has quickly adjusted to this new way of working, and maritime HR departments and our maritime clients, they have adjusted in the same way to how they're recruiting and onboarding people remotely. So, you know, every day via Zoom and Teams and software like this, interviews are happening, people are being profiled, testing is happening, and presentations and meet the teams are happening as part of a recruitment process. Companies have, or some companies have very quickly adapted their recruitment processes to reflect this new way of working. These companies clearly don't want to wait. They don't want to potentially lose out on hiring talent. They want to make sure that they can still get out and recruit these people. And when they're hiring these people, laptops are being delivered and onboarding is happening remotely. So companies are hiring people, and people, I guess, are starting new jobs never having met their work colleagues. And that's a bit of an unusual one, but they're coming in, their first day at work is at the kitchen table, and for the first time they meet their work colleagues over Teams and over Zoom. So interesting times indeed. Let's just have a little look at what's been happening over the last few weeks, because as we said earlier, this is a very dynamic marketplace. It changes all the time. And I've got to say, over the last few weeks, since the beginning of May, there is a definite sense of, dare I say it, but normalisation. Most leaders in maritime who I talk to, they just want to get on with it. And many think we could be like this for some time. March and April have been very much crisis management months. They certainly were for me and our senior team at Faststream. We were very much hunkered down in the bunker, working out how we were going to respond to this crisis and planning and strategizing, and we really were very inward looking, if you like, during that period of crisis management, because we were responding to lots of unknowns, and lots of decisions were made that really have shaped our strategy going forward. And I think most companies were the same. April and indeed March, they were in crisis management. But now most companies, I think they've quickly adapted to the new way of working, to the new norms, and they're really kind of getting on with it a bit more. So talking to CEOs who at the beginning of this process were, and I guess probably I was in this camp as well, if I'm honest, pretty reluctant home workers, and thought that we were all doomed because we were going to work from home, are now eulogising about the benefits of home working and increased productivity and fewer meetings and no commute. I'm not sat in traffic going to the office in the morning. The only thing I pass on in the morning on my commute to my office at home is the dog, and so it's a different world that we're now working in, and CEOs have adjusted pretty well to this new way of working. Already we're seeing some glimmers of optimism returning. We've certainly seen a big uptick since the beginning of May in vacancy numbers. Vacancy numbers in April were horrible. Vacancy numbers already in May are way better than they were in April, which is a good indication of companies getting on and getting back to business. If they're thinking about recruiting again, that's a good indication of how they feel about the world. And leaders who we are talking to, and I'm talking to, they're talking about what people they might need to capitalise on the bounce back. And I guess that's a really good sign that they're looking toward the future and thinking about who they might need to hire coming out the other side of this to make the most of the bounce back and what that looks like. So I'm gonna pause now and answer some questions, and then finish the session with looking at what the future impact may be of the crisis on people in the maritime. So kind of looking to the future and saying, okay, when we come out the other side of this, and as we come out the other side, what impact is this going to have on people in maritime? But I'd just like to go through a few of your questions. So thank you very much for so many good questions. I will do my best to answer as many as I can. I will try and pick up on some of the main themes. With so many people on the webinar, it's going to be difficult to answer everyone's questions, but we'll give this a good go. The biggest topic that I'd like to address at the start, and this is by far the area that has generated the most questions, is about working from home and remote working. And it's quite clear that this is very much a hot topic for both employers and employees alike. I can see from the questions that we've got employer-related questions about working from home and remote working, and I can see that we've got employees asking questions about this as well. So let's have a look at some of these questions, and I'll share some sort of top-level thoughts with you. So one of the questions was, will working from home continue post-crisis and be the new way of working in the maritime sector? Well, I think it's fair to say that working from home is certainly not for everyone. In our own organisation, we're just over 100 people, talking to the company and indeed talking to candidates in the outside world, it seems to be that working from home is very much like Marmite, and I hope a lot of you know what Marmite is, because half of you probably love Marmite and half of you probably hate it. And working from home seems to fall into two big camps. You know, half the people we talk to really don't like it at all. Half the people we talk to seem to absolutely love it. There seems to be a divide in two big groups of people who work from home. So it seems to be that the people who really can't wait to get back to the office are typically younger employees. And I just want to look at that a little bit. So younger employees seem to be not enjoying the working from home. One of the factors seems to be that they don't have their own workspace. Many of them live in small apartments or small houses, or indeed they live in a shared apartment or a shared house. So they don't necessarily have their own dedicated workspace. Many of these younger employees seem to be working on laptops, sat on the sofa on their knee, and they don't seem to be enjoying that very much. One of the big things that we hear from younger employees is that they really are missing the social aspects of work and the social aspects of going into the office. Now, Teams and Zoom Friday night, pub quizzes and Friday night drinks after work all together on Zoom is great, but the feedback is that the younger employees are really missing their work friends, they're missing the social interaction. And I think in today's world, pre-coronavirus, the whole kind of work, social life for younger people especially, but probably for all of us, blends into one. And younger people are finding that a real challenge. I think it's fair to say that what we hear is that mental well-being is certainly a much bigger topic with younger employees working from home. They're really struggling with some aspects of this working from home and are not enjoying it at all. We hear similar from employees who have young families, and they seem to find the challenge of juggling home work life with young children and focusing on work and having, again, dedicated workspace where they can really kind of shut themselves away and work is very difficult for them. And those two groups, younger employees and those who've got young families, seem pretty keen to get back into the office. The people who seem to be loving it are typically older, more senior, mid and senior career people who seem to be better placed to be able to work independently, and perhaps one of them told me they were very much enjoying the solitude. So I think it maybe is a reflection of an individual by individual basis, but certainly our older candidates, older employees, they seem to be better adjusted and to be enjoying working from home more. So I don't want to put people in boxes, because clearly there'll be people in both camps who do and don't like it. But there does seem to be a bit of a divide here. We hear this week that Twitter have announced that all of their employees globally are going to work from home forever now. They're not going to return to the office. I hear a lot from companies in the maritime sector that they're exploring working from home and the impacts of that on their business and how practical this might be, which really kind of reminds me of what happened coming out of the global financial crisis. Coming out of the global financial crisis, there was this very popular acronym called SOHO, and many of you will remember SOHO. SOHO stands for small office, home office. And so there was very much this concept that organisations, that businesses would have small offices that people could go to for meetings and would be sort of shared workspace and collaboration space where they could go to, but actually that they would have home offices and employees would work from home and would only really periodically visit the office. So this whole SOHO concept was back coming out of the global financial crisis, and it was very high profile. It had a lot of talk about it in the media, and some companies put it in place and looked at it, but it never really took off. And I think the thing with home working is that the idea of home working, and as we're finding right now, is much easier than the implementation. I think it very much depends on your culture as an organisation. I think it depends what your people do. And it also depends on what your internal management capabilities are, how well equipped you are as an organisation to manage home working. One of the questions that came up around home working was, how do I show an employer my capabilities if I've never even met them? Well, I think the key thing here is that if you're going through a remote recruitment process, or if you're a company who are recruiting people remotely and you're now adapting your selection process to using Zoom and Teams and the like, really you're running a very similar process. You're just utilising the technology. So I'm not sure really that the actual selection and recruitment process changes that much. You're really just using a different medium to embrace that. Now, what I've seen is from searches that I'm involved in right now and work that I'm doing right now with companies is that we're putting more steps into the process. Because we feel that having more steps in the process makes it a better process, that we get more kind of opportunity to look at candidates with more steps in the process, but also because with this new technology and people not having to travel, it's much easier to do that. It's much easier to have these additional steps in the process, and we can afford to be able to do that and get a closer look at candidates. And so if you're a candidate who's going through this process, I think you've got to conduct yourself in the same way as if you were being interviewed face to face, and you've got to remember all the good things about how to apply for a job and all that goes with it. So one of the questions was, is this an opportunity for employers to hire hard to recruit talent remotely? Well, I think yes, it is. And I think that perhaps with travel restrictions, and we're hearing already that there might be a tightening of work permit restrictions in some countries, like Singapore, for example, that being harder to get work permits for expatriates, for example, that actually you might choose to have people work remotely and to utilise this technology. And perhaps the coronavirus and going through this now has set us up quite well to be able to do that. And so perhaps this does give us an opportunity to hire talent that we wouldn't normally be able to hire and have it working remotely, because these people who can't relocate or don't want to relocate can now work for organisations. So there was this question around, how can we maintain our company culture remotely? And I think the key here is really about over communication. Certainly something that we've had to do as a business is make sure that we're over communicating to people. There is clearly a line where over communication is not healthy and you're just bombarding people with messages all the time. And so you've got to get that right. You've got to get this communication piece correct, because people worry, they don't hear from you. Why haven't I heard from my company? What's happening? What are they planning? Or, the like. So people are worried about their jobs. And so you've got to make sure that we're over communicating and reassuring people around what they're doing. So the working from home topic appears on the face of it to be quite simple, but really it's quite complex, and it's made up of a lot of component parts. And so I think organisations are going to have to work really hard to be able to put this in place in an effective way and to implement this really well. A lot of companies like us, we've had to implement this very quickly to respond to the coronavirus, but we've got to learn from this. We've got to adapt what's gone well, what's not, and make changes for the longer term, either because we think we're going to be in this longer term or because we think that it's going to become something that employees look for through choice. But we're going to have to adapt what we do going forward. There are a lot of questions, very specific questions from seafarers about the length of time on board, about the attrition of seafarers because they have been kept on board vessels, because they haven't been able to disembark and get off the vessels, because of crew rotation challenges. There's been a lot of questions from seafarers about COVID-safe workplaces, COVID-safe vessels. There's been a lot of questions about testing, about quarantining before getting on board vessels. I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer those questions. I think there are people who are much better qualified than I am to answer those questions. And I think at this stage, my advice would be to follow the advice of the organisations that you work in, and to listen to their guidance. And for those organisations, they will in turn follow the advice put in place by governments and through the regulatory bodies. So I'm not going to kind of go off and look at that in a topic on its own. There's been quite a lot of questions from companies about hiring and how hard it is going to be to hire right now. And I think it's fair to say it is going to be difficult to hire people right now, because people don't necessarily want to change jobs unless you have been forced to change jobs because you've been laid off, or you're sort of fearful that you're going to lose your job. A lot of people during difficult times, they just do nothing, they sit tight, and a lot of people out there will not change jobs during this period because they're worried about job security, they're worried about qualifying for government support if they do change jobs and then they lose their jobs. But of course there will still be people who will move. There will still be people who are worried about their job and will jump ship because they're worried about it, or people who have lost their jobs and who will apply and who will move. We talk about very quickly kind of three groups of candidates: active job seekers, people who are applying for jobs all the time. We talk about passive job seekers, people who are very passive, they don't have CVs, they're not applying for jobs, they're being approached, they work probably in skill short sectors. And then we also talk about this group of people called what we call tiptoers. And they're kind of these people who need persuading gently, they're tiptoeing through the employment market. And at the moment, these tiptoers, they really are tiptoeing through the employment market, and they need a lot of reassurance. They're going to ask a lot of questions, they need their hand holding, and their questions are not just about COVID safe workplaces, but they have questions about the security of organisations and, you know, longer term job security and what happens if I join, you know, and then something changes. They need a lot of reassurance through this process. A lot of questions from people who are clearly job hunting, asking about, are people still hiring? Yes, they are. Companies still very much are hiring, and we have, as I say, in the last couple of weeks of May have seen a big uptick in vacancy numbers, and so the world continues to move. Talent still very much is in demand. Companies will still need to employ people, and this will continue. Companies will continue to hire people. Yes, there will be sectors, and there are sectors that are hard hit, but even within those hard hit sectors, there are still companies who are still hiring. Cruise is incredibly hard hit, massively hard hit, but we are still making placements with some of the companies in the cruise sector, because some of those companies are being kind of more aggressive than others and trying to get out there and hire talent. And this will be the same across all of the sectors of maritime. There will be companies who are still hiring regardless, and so keep at it. If you're looking for a job, don't give up. Keep the faith, polish up your CV, and make sure you're applying for stuff that you really can do and giving it your best shot. And so what I would like to do really is I'd like to sort of sum up and kind of look at the possible impacts here. And there's going to be lots of impact from the coronavirus and the crisis on people in maritime. But I just want to touch on a few sort of kind of hot topics that I think are going to be particularly relevant here that will come into play. So I think the first thing is the world of work may well and probably is going to change as a result of the crisis. Working from home may become a normal part of our lives, either because we have to, because we're waiting for a vaccine to be found, or because it takes time for a vaccine to come into place and social distancing and lockdown continue, so we have to therefore work from home, and therefore it is a normal part of our lives, or because we want to, or because our employees want to. Now, I don't think that coming out of the crisis that we're going to see a wholesale change where everyone in maritime all of a sudden starts working from home, but I do think we'll see companies using this as an opportunity to kind of overcome these things we talked about around global mobility and work permits, costs and cost of infrastructure. Companies are going to want more flexible solutions coming out the other side of this, and consequently we will see more people work from home. I think that's going to happen. and some companies will be quicker to embrace that than others, and some sectors of maritime will be better placed to put that in place than others, but it's going to happen. I think the other big thing that we're going to see is this whole concept of COVID safe workplaces. COVID safe workplaces will be expected. In fact, I'm not sure that expected even is a strong enough word. I think COVID safe workplaces will become demanded and even become essential, and probably in some countries become a legal requirement. And I think it's fair to say that COVID safe workplaces will potentially be a competitive advantage for employers of choice. Being able to promote to prospective employees, or to indeed just to your own employees, how safe your workplace is, could be a competitive advantage going forward. And I know that talking to companies, that there's a lot of activity going on behind the scenes around planning for how businesses will return and how they will put in place COVID safe workplaces. And that's going to be a big factor for the maritime sector. Remote interview processes and onboarding. So companies are going to embrace this going forward. It's quick, it's easy, it's inexpensive, it's very practical. Will it replace face-to-face interviews? Not in all cases, but I do think that remote interviewing, remote selection processes, remote onboarding, I think it will become increasingly common, and I think in some organisations it will become the norm. And so I think that's one to watch going forward. I think the whole mobility piece will remain a challenge for quite some time. So even after borders reopen, there will be a foreseeable sort of reduction in travel. I think that people will be reluctant to travel. And I think that's going to be a challenge for the maritime sector that is so interconnected, it is so globally mobile, and it is so reliant on travel. I think that we're going to have challenges there. I think that, you think of the amount of travel that your typical superintendent, for example, puts in over the course of a business year. Some of those superintendents, they're not going to be very keen on getting on and off of planes every 5 minutes and traveling around the world. And again, I think that's going to put a greater emphasis on in-country and local solutions for companies. And that's going to change the makeup of teams. It's going to change the makeup of businesses, and companies are going to have to adapt their model to be able to cater for that. And that's going to create a lot of change in the maritime sector. And I think then finally, companies are really going to want more agile, flexible employment solutions. I think agility will be a key word coming out the other side of this. I think that organisations are going to want greater agility, and part of that is going to be about having flexible employment solutions. And I don't just mean flexible employment solutions in the concept of having people on contract and hire and fire. I mean in terms of nationalities of crew on board vessels. I mean in terms of in-country solutions. The whole thing is going to need to be more flexible to cater for this, and that's going to be partly a reflection of companies being beaten up during these tough times, but also it's going to be a reflection of companies adapting their way of working to this kind of new world that we might come into post-coronavirus. So I think that's a few of the points here. There's more clearly, and I'm sure all of you out there today can think of new ways that you think this will impact the maritime sector, but that's just some of the headline points that I'd like to share with you on my perspective of kind of the impact of this and what I think will happen. That really brings us to a close today. We've covered a lot of ground in a short space of time. I hope that you have found it useful, and I hope that you and your families are holding up okay during these challenging times. I'd like once again to thank you very much for all of your questions, and thank you for taking the time to join me today. I'm going to go through your questions, and I'll do my best to either put together a content piece or to reach out to you directly, whichever works best, to try and answer as many of these questions that you've got, these specific questions that you've got that you've come through. I really want to do my best to answer these questions that you've put at me, so thank you for that. So I think I'll just finish up by saying stay well, and thank you very much for joining me today.